In the shadow of the spotlight. The city buzzed beneath vast skies, a patchwork of concrete, glass, and neon lights that rarely slept. Within an expansive, sunlit apartment nestled in a middle-class neighborhood, the Parker family had carved out a life that was comfortable, if not lavish. Their home was filled with the muted hum of achievement, honor roll certificates framed in the hallway, piano notes trailing down the stairs, and polite smiles exchanged over breakfast. Emily, the elder sister, was the embodiment of everything the world seemed to desire. From her earliest years, she drew praise like a magnet. A precocious child who spoke with clarity far beyond her age, a straight-A student who balanced academics with an effortless grace in every extracurricular. Teachers adored her, neighbors commented on her potential. Emily's laughter was bright, the kind that filled a room and made even strangers take notice. Julia, by contrast, felt as if she moved in a different world, a world hovering just outside the warm circle of admiration that followed Emily. She was quiet, thoughtful, more inclined to observe than to speak. When relatives visited, the conversation would inevitably drift toward Emily's latest achievements, leaving Julia smiling politely, hoping no one would notice her shrinking into the wallpaper. She worked hard at school, but her grades were good enough, never astonishing. Her interests were softer, more private, sketching in spiral notebooks, reading novels late at night with a flashlight tucked under her blanket. These were small joys, invisible to everyone but herself. Underneath her calm exterior, Julia carried a restless ache, a silent question that grew heavier with each compliment paid to her sister. Why not me? Every comparison, however unintentional, carved new fissures inside her. She lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for her own moment in the sun, even as it felt impossibly out of reach. Their parents, well-meaning and loving, didn't seem to notice the growing divide. They challenged Julia to come out of her shell, or to try harder like Emily, never realizing that their gentle encouragement stung like rejection. The family dinners were cordial, never tense, but Julia often caught herself studying her spoon, tuning out of conversations she felt didn't invite her participation. In the privacy of her room, she sometimes imagined what it would be like if the tables were turned. If she were the sister everyone noticed, if Emily ever had to wrestle with envy or invisibility. Outside their home, the city's relentless pace served only to magnify Julia's sense of smallness. At school, her teachers remembered her as Emily's little sister. Her classmates, too, seemed subtly aware of the unspoken hierarchy. Julia kept a small circle of friends, all of whom had learned to avoid mentioning Emily in conversation. Still, the comparison lingered in every sideways glance, every casual mention of Emily's victories. Despite the gossamer threads of jealousy, Julia wanted to love her sister. She remembered childhood games, shared secrets, and late-night giggling in the dark. Yet as the years accumulated and the spotlight on Emily burned ever brighter, Julia found her own feelings darkening, growing more complicated, resentment flickering alongside love. In the city's heart, amid its careless brilliance, Julia walked unnoticed, overshadowed by a sister whose brilliance was so blinding. Julia sometimes wondered if she might disappear altogether. This was the world from which her longing and wounded pride would eventually grow, the quiet darkness after the thunder of applause. The first crack. The new school year began like a theater curtain parting, bright, expectant, full of roles to play and scenes to perform. For most students at Lincoln High, September brought a familiar mix of nerves and hope. For Julia, it meant bracing herself for another year beneath the shadow cast by Emily. Emily, now a senior, carried herself with the assurance of someone used to applause. Student council president, lead pianist in the jazz band, track team captain, Her schedule was a grid of ambition, and she moved through her days at a tireless pace. Teachers sought her out for advice on organizing school events. Classmates vied for a spot at her lunch table. Even principals mentioned her name as an example to follow during assemblies. Julia, entering her junior year, felt the gaps in her own life growing more noticeable with each passing semester. She attended classes with a quiet diligence, keeping her eyes on her notebooks as lessons blurred together. She loved art class most. Mrs. Navarro sometimes knelt beside her desk to compliment her sketches of city rooftops and nighttime scenes. Small moments Julia cherished. But her other subjects were a daily struggle, with grades that hovered in the comfortable, forgettable middle. What hurt most was not the lack of recognition, but the constant comparison, spoken and unspoken. When teachers realized Emily and Julia were sisters, eyebrows raised just a bit higher, expectations sharpened. "You must be just as brilliant as your sister," one commented in passing on the first day of English. The classmates' knowing glances made Julia's face burn in humiliation. At home, the pattern continued. Emily recounted her accomplishments at the dinner table: a scholarship interview, another club leadership position, a glowing letter from a teacher. Julia offered news of her own, but her words felt faint, as if swallowed by the room's admiration for her sister. "That's nice, honey," her mother would say absently before asking Emily more questions about her busy schedule. Despite it all, Julia tried to carve a place for herself. She volunteered to help set up for the fall festival. She joined the art club, staying late after school to paint backdrops for the homecoming dance. Each effort was a bid for attention, for a moment of acknowledgement that belonged only to her. Occasionally, she glimpsed pride in her father's eyes when he came to pick her up, but it vanished quickly when Emily entered the conversation, arms full of trophies or awards. Change arrived, unexpected and thrilling, in the form of Ryan. Ryan was new to Lincoln High, a transfer student with an easy grin and an artistic streak that drew Julia in. They first spoke during a late afternoon in the art room, sharing paintbrushes and stories of favorite books. For the first time in months, Julia felt seen. She wasn't Emily's sister to Ryan. She was just Julia. They became friends, then a couple. Julia, tentative yet hopeful, found comfort in their quiet moments. Walks in the city park, long talks over coffee, laughter in spaces where Emily's name never surfaced. With Ryan, Julia's confidence bloomed. Even her mother noticed the difference, remarking on the changes in her mood and smile. But even in this fragile happiness, the world seemed to test her resolve. Friends murmured, "You're so lucky, Julia," as if luck was her only asset. At school events, people subtly compared Ryan's charisma to Emily's latest achievements, always setting Julia in the shadow of someone brighter. The first crack in Julia's world appeared gradually, almost invisibly. A sidelong glance here, a misunderstood comment there, a well-intentioned compliment from a teacher. "I hope you blossom like your sister with your talents, Julia," stung rather than soothed. Ryan, too, occasionally mentioned how impressive Emily seemed, innocently unaware of how those words chipped at Julia's pride. Bit by bit, small disappointments stacked atop the old ache. The paint stains on Julia's hands became reminders not just of her creativity, but of how desperately she worked to be noticed, to be valued for who she was, not who she might someday become. By autumn's end, the season's golden light could not hide the fracture running through Julia's life. Though she grasped at moments of happiness and self-assurance, doubt and sadness persisted, quiet but unyielding. The world's admiration for Emily remained as constant as the city's hum. For Julia, the challenge now was not only to silence the comparisons, but to stop measuring her own worth by a spotlight that was never meant to be shared. Unbeknownst to her, That fragile balance was about to be tested further, by betrayal in its most personal form. But for now, beneath the crisp air of October, Julia stood on the edge of change, the first crack widening, and the foundation of sisterhood beginning to shift forever. Stolen love. It started innocently enough. A few words exchanged in the hallway, a lingering glance during dinner, gentle laughter echoing from the living room. At first, Julia noticed nothing out of the ordinary. She was busy with school, wrapped up in art club projects, and the new, unfamiliar warmth of having someone like Ryan beside her. With autumn's crisp air and the streets glowing orange from falling leaves, she felt, for a short while, almost content. Emily had always been friendly with Julia's friends and, by extension, her boyfriends. She knew how to make people feel comfortable, how to listen without judgment, how to draw out stories and laughter even from strangers. But this time, something about her interactions with Ryan unsettled Julia, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way Emily complimented his sketches when he showed them off, or how she laughed a little too long at his jokes. Julia reasoned with herself. Emily was just being nice, the way she always was. As the days went by, however, Julia began to notice subtle changes. Ryan started spending more time at their house even when Julia was busy, lingering after dinner or arriving early to help with homework. Julia found them together in the kitchen, chatting softly, their conversation abruptly dropping off as she entered. Sometimes they seemed to share private jokes Julia didn't understand. She told herself she was imagining things. She was being paranoid, letting her insecurities get the best of her. One Friday evening, Julia arrived home later than usual after an exhausting rehearsal for the fall festival. She'd sent Ryan a quick text to let him know she'd be running late. When she slipped quietly into the apartment, her footsteps silenced by the thick carpet, she heard voices floating down from the den. The soft, unguarded tones of her sister and her boyfriend. Curious but unsuspecting, she tiptoed closer, freezing as Emily's laugh rang out. A melodic sound Julia recognized as reserved for people she truly liked. She peeked in and saw them on the couch, sitting closer than she would have liked. Emily's hand touched Ryan's arm, a gesture lingering just a beat too long. Ryan's head dipped toward Emily as he whispered something. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of dread and disbelief swelling inside her. That night, Julia barely slept. Memories tumbled restlessly through her mind, small moments from the past few weeks suddenly acquiring new, ominous meanings. The way Ryan's eyes followed Emily at dinner. The times he'd text Julia to say he was busy, only for Emily to later mention he'd stopped by the house. She fought against the swirl of anger and confusion, scolding herself for doubting not just her boyfriend, but her own sister. But the universe, it seemed, conspired to force the truth into the open. Days later, as Julia was unpacking supplies in the art room, her phone buzzed with a message. It was meant for Ryan, from Emily, a gushy string of inside jokes, punctuated by a heart emoji. Julia stared in disbelief, denial quickly giving way to a crushing sense of betrayal. Her hands trembled as she scrolled up, reading message after message. Emily confiding in Ryan, Ryan venting about Julia. The language between them growing more intimate, more secretive. The confrontation, when it came, was a quiet storm. Julia found Ryan outside school, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. She demanded answers in a voice lower than she'd ever used, trembling not with rage, but with hurt. Ryan's explanations were halting, defensive. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Emily she understands me. I'm sorry, Julia." Julia's world buckled at the edges. That night, she knocked on Emily's bedroom door, unable to contain her pain. Her voice shook as she asked why. Why her own sister would do something so cruel. Why she would steal the one person who made her feel seen. Emily's answer was tearful, but not apologetic enough. She blamed their closeness, blamed herself for not stopping things sooner, but never uttered the words Julia needed to hear. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." For days, Julia drifted through their apartment in a daze. Her parents noticed her silence but mistook it for stress. She deleted Ryan's number, erased every photo of him from her phone. Yet the sting lingered, sharp and restless, carving hollows in her heart. What wounded her most wasn't simply losing her boyfriend, but the realization that her own sister had crossed an invisible line. A line Julia had always believed, no matter how jealous or overshadowed she felt, would never be broken. As autumn darkened into winter, the Parker home became a landscape of unspoken tension. Emily tried to make amends in small ways, offering Julia rides to school, leaving notes on her pillow. But the trust between them had snapped, replaced by a cold distance neither sister knew how to bridge. Julia's heartbreak was layered, part loss, part humiliation, part bitter understanding. For so long, she'd wished only for a piece of Emily's light, a moment to feel special, just once. Instead, she was left with emptiness, and the silent knowledge that the first and deepest betrayal had come from the person she had loved the most. Silence and accumulation. In the weeks that followed the unraveling of her world, Julia moved through the Parker apartment as though underwater. The air felt thicker, every sound muffled, every movement slow and deliberate, as if in some effort to avoid shattering what little remained of her sense of self. There were no angry confrontations, no scenes of rage or screaming matches between sisters. Instead, there was a brittle, frigid quiet, a silence that seemed to seep into the cracks of the house, winding its way between Julia and Emily as surely as any locked door. Julia learned to vanish into this silence. She woke early, tiptoeing around the apartment before anyone else stirred. She took longer routes to her classes at school, careful to avoid not just Emily, but the friends the two of them had once shared. She stopped pausing at the family photos in the hallway, photos that, even now, depicted unbroken smiles and arms thrown around each other, illusions from another lifetime. At home, mealtimes became a performance of politeness. Their parents, busy with work and distracted by their own routines, missed the subtle shift. They encouraged conversation, complimented Emily's latest scholarship acceptance letter, and praised Julia for finishing a painting that now hung near the front door. But the warmth that had once radiated from family dinners was gone, replaced by a carefully constructed surface that everyone, consciously or not, worked to maintain. Emily's attempts at reaching out became increasingly awkward and infrequent as days passed. One night, she left a note on Julia's desk. "I miss you. Please don't shut me out." Julia read it in the lamplight, her chest tightening with everything left unsaid. She tucked the note in the bottom drawer and never replied. The world outside their apartment only sharpened Julia's isolation. At school, she lost herself in her art, pouring frustration and sorrow into brushstrokes and pencil lines. Her drawings darkened. Cityscapes turned moody and lonely, her once delicate portraits now shadowed, the faces half turned away. Mrs. Navarro, her art teacher, tried to draw Julia out, inviting her to join an after-school exhibition or simply to talk, but Julia deflected, insisting she was just tired from studying. Friendships shifted. The few friends Julia had kept drifted to Emily's orbit or faded away, unsure how to bridge the chasm they sensed but couldn't name. In hallways and classrooms, Julia became background noise, another face in the crowd. The looks that used to greet her were now replaced with glances that slipped past, tinged with awkward sympathy or outright avoidance. Rumors spread, subtle and persistent, about what had happened between her, Emily, and Ryan. Julia ignored them, though each whisper felt like a fresh paper cut against already raw nerves. The absence of Ryan loomed in every empty seat, every crossed path. If she glimpsed him in the hall, Ryan barely met her eyes before hurrying off, guilt etched into his posture. On the rare occasions their paths crossed during group events or art club meetings, an awkward silence would descend, broken only by the polite, distant murmurs required by circumstance. Julia sometimes wondered if it would have been easier if he'd never transferred to Lincoln High at all. Yet, despite it all, Julia refused to talk about the betrayal. Not to her parents, not to her remaining friends, not even to herself in the pages of her journal. Her grief compressed inward, a heavy ache she carried with her everywhere. She told herself it was better this way, suffering in silence, refusing to give Emily or Ryan the satisfaction of seeing her break down. But the pain festered, growing sharper with every quiet, lonely day. The city, with its riot of colors and constant hum, became her only solace. Julia began, taking long walks after school, bundling herself in a scarf and wandering the side streets where no one knew her name. She'd sketch local shops and stray cats, painting scenes of solitude from park benches and deserted plazas. It was only during these walks, surrounded by strangers and traffic, that her loneliness felt less acute. Sometimes she'd watch the sunset from a rooftop parking lot, the city burning gold and orange beneath her. For a brief moment then, she could pretend the world was hers alone. No comparisons, no judgment, just Julia and the widening sky. Meanwhile, the chasm between sisters grew deeper and more perilous. Emily threw herself into her usual whirlwind of activity, organizing rallies for student council, practicing piano until midnight, volunteering on weekends, collecting accolades that Julia once admired but now only resented. Julia would hear her laughing to friends on the phone, the familiar sound now sliced through with bitterness. Occasionally, she'd come home to find Emily sitting on the couch, eyes puffy, as if she'd just been crying, but they never spoke of it. No apologies, no explanations. Each kept their pain folded tightly inside, unwilling, or unable, to reach across the divide. The holidays arrived, bringing with them distant relatives, festive dinners, and the ever-present glow of Emily's accomplishments. Julia endured it all in silence. She listened as her grandparents gushed over Emily's achievements, as her aunts asked for college advice, as uncles patted Julia on the shoulder and told her she'd find her way soon, too, just like her sister. She smiled and swallowed resentment, excusing herself early to hide upstairs with her sketchbook. She overheard Emily, cornered by a family friend, insisting everything between the sisters was fine, just busy with school. Julia wondered if Emily believed the lie. One late night in December, while the apartment lay shrouded in sleep, Julia stood by her window watching soft snow accumulate on fire escapes and street lamps. She pressed her forehead to the glass, breath fogging the view, heart heavy with words she'd never speak. The betrayal wasn't just a single moment, she realized, but a series of small hurts that had been building for years. The comparisons, the overlooked talents, the way she'd always been a footnote to Emily's story. Losing Ryan was simply the final blow, a rupture that made every old wound ache anew. Still, Julia told herself she would survive. She'd keep her head down, finish the school year, and dream of a time and place where she could finally be known not for what she'd lost, but for what she created. But beneath her resolve, grief accumulated like snow, drifting heavier by the day, threatening to bury her beneath its silent weight. Unbeknownst to anyone, not even Julia herself, this steady, stubborn silence was changing her. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, mingled with the ache of longing and the sting of humiliation. In time, these emotions would harden not just into cautious self-protection, but into something darker, something that, when provoked, might seek not solace, but revenge. And so, The Parker sisters drifted further apart, each marooned on their own island of heartache. On the surface, nothing about their routines suggested tragedy or malice. But in the quiet, in the lull between conversations, an undercurrent pulled them in opposite directions. The cracks had begun to spread, invisible to all but those who looked close enough to see the pain behind Julia's silence and Emily's outward perfection. Winter's cold settled in, and still no words passed between them that might heal the breach. The Parker home, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with a restless quiet, foretelling that the storm brewing beneath would soon be too powerful to contain. The revenge plan. The turning point came one bleary morning in February, when Julia, bleary-eyed and numb, realized she no longer recognized the person staring back at her in the mirror. Shadows circled her eyes, her lips pressed together in a tight, uncertain line. For weeks she'd drifted through life, letting wounds fester beneath a mask of silence, hoping time or distance would dull the ache. But nothing changed. If anything, Emily's glow only seemed to intensify, and the uneven scale of their world grew ever more unbearable. One afternoon, as snow dusted the city streets, Julia found herself alone in the apartment, wandering from room to room, the chilled air settling around her like a shroud. She traced her finger over framed photos, holidays, birthdays, recitals, searching for proof that things had ever been different. Not once did Emily's arm drape around her with any genuine sense of affection. Not once did Julia see herself as truly belonging in those smiling clusters. She felt invisible, even in the evidence of her own life. Her anger, once a dull ember, flared. "Why am I always the one who has to swallow it?" she whispered, her breath fogging up the glass of the family portrait. "Why does she always get away with everything?" The question echoed through empty rooms. Julia gripped the frame until her knuckles whitened, a surge of something dark and determined blooming inside her. That night, after her parents had gone to bed and Emily was out at another student council meeting, Julia sat at her desk, illuminated by the glow of her desk lamp. Her fingers skated across a crisp page in her sketchbook, but this time she wasn't drawing city lights or stray cats. She began a new series, this one outlined not in pencil, but in thought. A step-by-step plan, methodical as an architect's blueprint, a plan for revenge. First, she listed everything she knew about Emily's life, her schedule, her circle of friends, her digital secrets. Julia was no stranger to observing from the margins. She'd always noticed details others missed, the late-night texts, the whispers behind closed doors, the way Emily erased her browser history or flinched when her phone buzzed near their parents. Julia started collecting evidence, screenshots of Emily's less-than-innocent group chats, photos of suspicious receipts, reminders of minor wrongdoings Emily had always managed to conceal beneath her golden girl veneer. Julia combed through their home for more ammunition. In Emily's room, off-limits usually, but Emily was gone and Julia felt justified. She examined drawers and notebooks. She discovered doodled journal entries full of confessions, fears about maintaining her perfect image, half-hearted apologies never sent. Julia felt a sting of guilt reading them, but she reminded herself of all the nights she'd spent awake, heartbroken and alone, while Emily's world spun easily on. In the digital world, she found more. A secret second Instagram account, messages sent to an older college boy, subtle manipulations in the group project chat. No single thing was catastrophic on its own. Together, they painted a portrait that was far less flawless than anyone suspected. Still, Julia wanted her revenge to be more than petty exposure. She didn't wish to destroy Emily's life completely, at least not at first. What she craved, at her core, was acknowledgement. She wanted their family, their community, to understand the truth, that Emily was not infallible, and that Julia herself had meaning and power beyond the boundaries of her sister's shadow. So she hatched a plan for the upcoming family gathering. The annual March reunion, when both sides of their sprawling extended family would fill the apartment with laughter, stories, and inevitable praise for Emily. She began laying the groundwork, subtle at first. In conversations with cousins, she hinted at things Emily had said, the nasty remarks masked as jokes, the critical observations passed off as concern. She left Emily's secret accounts accidentally logged in on the family computer, quietly watching to see who would notice. She corralled supportive messages from the few friends she had left, asking them to corroborate the stories she was preparing to tell. Julia even worked on her own narrative, her moment under the spotlight at the reunion, rehearsing what she would say, how she would stand, how she would hold back tears or anger until just the right moment. She imagined the silence that would fall, the questioning looks, the way people would finally see behind Emily's mask, and for once, look for Julia among the ruins. Her anger spurred her on, but beneath it lurked something softer, a fragile hope that, after the chaos, someone might finally pay attention to her pain. Emily, ever busy with her whirlwind of activities, had no idea what was brewing. She was distracted, juggling college applications, scholarship essays, endless group chats, and social events. Occasionally, she tried to draw Julia back into her orbit, an invitation to brunch here, a shared meme there. But Julia responded with chilly indifference, sharp enough to deter further attempts. Tensions at home rose, but halted just short of open conflict. Their parents, caught up in the bustle of work and family logistics, remained oblivious. As March drew closer, Julia intensified her efforts. She memorized the times when Emily was at her most vulnerable, cataloged which relatives were most likely to believe her, and selected the moments when the truth would have the greatest impact. She prepared physical evidence, screen captures, copied journal entries, printouts hidden in an unassuming folder beneath her bed. In parallel, she built barriers inside herself, compartmentalizing the anxiety and guilt that crept in late at night. Sometimes, as she reread Emily's frantic notes or watched her sister arrive home with red-rimmed eyes, a furtive tenderness would flicker. Julia reminded herself that Emily's choices had brought them both to this bitter crossroads. "She hurt me first," Julia muttered. "She chose herself. Now I will too." The evening before the reunion, Julia could barely sleep. Her stomach twisted with dread, but her mind raced with details. What would she say if Emily burst into tears? How would she face her parents? Would anyone believe her, or would everyone think she was motivated purely by jealousy? She rehearsed her script repeatedly in the quiet dark, willing herself not to falter. Outside, a late winter wind swept the city, rattling the window panes. Julia sat upright in bed, clutching the folder that contained the sum of Emily's secrets. She thought of everything she had lost, her boyfriend, her dignity, years of belonging, and let herself hope, for the briefest moment, that after tomorrow, everything would change. Morning dawned gray and cold. Julia dressed carefully, pulling her hair away from her face, wanting nothing to shield her when the time finally came. She slipped the folder into her backpack, breathing deeply. Downstairs, she could already hear the familiar voices of relatives, the distant music of Emily's laughter. She paused at the doorway to her room, glancing back one final time, as if she might leave the grieving version of herself behind and step out, at last, as someone new, someone unafraid to claim what she was owed. The stage was set. Julia's heart thudded in her chest, equal parts righteous and terrified. Today, she would be invisible no more. The fateful family gathering. The day of the family reunion arrived beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter, Clouds pressed low over the city as if in anticipation. Inside the Parker apartment, golden light and the scent of roast chicken and freshly baked bread attempted to conjure warmth against the gray chill outside. The rooms vibrated with the bustle of aunts in bright sweaters, boisterous uncles, squabbling cousins racing between rooms, and the gentle, comforting refrain of grandparents' laughter. It was the kind of scene that belonged to a world far removed from secrets and pain, a tableau, Julia thought, that would have inspired one of her old watercolors, had she still possessed the will to capture joy. For as long as she could remember, these reunions had been Emily's time to shine. Every few minutes, a relative would catch her by the arm, asking about college acceptances, leadership positions, music recitals. Emily, true to form, moved from group to group with a practiced smile and unwavering poise. She dispensed hugs, accepted heartfelt congratulations, and fielded questions with practiced humility. In the living room, her latest trophy was displayed on the mantelpiece, a glinting symbol of success that was as much a fixture as the Parker family itself. Julia hovered at the periphery, clutching a mug of cocoa that had long since gone lukewarm, her thumb tracing the chipped rim as if searching for a crack. She watched the swirl of relatives ushering Emily from one conversation to the next with a silent ache. Every cheerful anecdote about her sister was a fresh reminder of the plan lying in her bag upstairs, patiently waiting for its moment. The anxiety Julia felt was a living thing, coiled and restless in her chest, churning her stomach, prickling at her palms whenever she imagined the confrontation to come. Her mind played out every possible scenario. The disbelief in her parents' eyes, the protective huddle of the adults around Emily, the hurt and anger that would fracture the family's fragile good cheer. And then, the cold satisfaction, however fleeting, when Julia's voice could no longer be ignored. But first, there was the waiting. She retreated to the kitchen, dutifully arranging desserts on china plates as her mother directed a culinary symphony of last-minute finishing touches. Aunt Laurie asked about her art club, complimenting Julia on a recent painting she'd heard about through the grapevine. Julia smiled back, her answers short and polite. No one lingered long on her side of the room. Even now, she found herself the background to someone else's main event. Tension ratcheted up as the afternoon wore on. Julia kept checking the clock, feeling the heaviness of the folder in her bag, a physical weight she could not escape. She watched as Emily, radiating confidence, posed for pictures with grandparents, artfully maneuvered awkward conversations, comforted a toddler cousin after a fall. Each gesture seemed sincere, but to Julia, every kindness felt strategically placed. A carefully embroidered patch on an otherwise perfect tapestry, designed to keep the world's approval tightly wrapped around her. Upstairs, in the small guest room that doubled as Julia's makeshift studio, her folder sat beneath a pile of sketchbooks, its contents organized and labeled. Messages, journal excerpts, screenshots. She'd read through them so many times that the words had begun to lose their meaning, and yet the truth within them still burned bright and ugly. Finally, the moment arrived. Dinner was over, the dining table crowded with empty plates and half-finished glasses of wine. The family, cheeks flushed from food and laughter, drifted back to the living room for the next act of the evening. Stories, music, speeches. Emily, of course, was invited to play the piano. As her fingers danced across the keys, Julia felt the room swell with pride and affection. Afterwards, Emily was enveloped in applause that echoed in Julia's veins. Her father, rising with a practiced flourish, called for quiet. "Let's have a round of gratitude," he announced, gesturing for the children, mostly nearly grown now, to share their recent joys and hopes for the future. Julia's turn came after Emily's graceful, grateful remarks, which drew warm smiles and no shortage of misty eyes. Julia stood, her legs trembling. Her voice, at first, was nearly swallowed by the buzz of conversation. I have something I'd like to share," she began. An uneasy hush fell. She drew her folder from her lap, fingers brushing over the worn cardstock, every muscle in her body bracing for the collision ahead. It wasn't anger that drove Julia forward, but the desperate need to be seen, as someone with a story that mattered, someone who could force a room to listen and just maybe to understand her pain. She spoke not with venom, but with quiet determination. "There are things about Emily," she said slowly, holding the folder tightly in both hands, "that I think everyone deserves to know." For a few seconds, no one moved. The children fidgeted. A glass clinked. Emily's eyes widened, fear, confusion, and the first flicker of panic moving across her face. Julia opened the folder and began reading. First excerpts from messages discovered months before, then snippets from Emily's journal detailing secrets and manipulations, pieces of evidence that peeled away the perfect veneer her sister had so carefully maintained. She spoke of betrayal, of being forgotten, of wounds hidden behind smiles. A gasp rippled across the room as realization dawned in the faces around her. Her voice trembled but did not break. Some relatives, Emily's closest admirers, protested, florid with indignation. Others listened, stricken. Her mother covered her mouth. Her father's gaze swung uncertainly from one daughter to the other, as if searching for some way to patch the rift now gaping before him. The sharp scent of spilled wine permeated the air. Emily tried at first to interrupt, her carefully composed facade crumbling as accusations and truths tumbled out. "It's not like that. I can explain," she stammered, but the tide was against her. Julia, for once, commanded the room. She finished, chest heaving, clutching the empty folder as if it could shield her from the silence that followed. For the first time, Julia was the center of attention. Yet, instead of triumph, a kind of emptiness filled her. She looked around at a family shaken and unsure, at her sister's tear-streaked face, and wondered, for a sliver of a second, if victory could ever feel colder. The gathering did not dissolve in immediate chaos. Instead, it wilted beneath the strain. Relatives made excuses to leave early, pressing awkward hugs upon both girls. Her parents stood together on the edge of the room, stunned and deeply wounded. Emily slipped away upstairs, the door closing softly behind her. The bright, golden light of the Parker apartment seemed to dim, and Julia, left with her open folder and hollow exhaustion, understood that some truths, even when spoken out loud, were not easily mended. That night, as the house finally emptied and cold pressed in from the darkened windows, Julia sat alone. The belonging she had yearned for all her life still felt just out of reach. Changed, broken, and irreversibly complicated by the cost of her revelation. The silence in the apartment had taken on a new edge. It was the silence after an explosion, when the world holds its breath, unsure how to pick up the pieces. The truth exposed. In the stark aftermath of the gathering, the Parker apartment seemed to hold its breath. The echoes of Julia's revelations reverberated through the walls, leaving behind a quiet far heavier than before. The truth, once carefully locked away in journals and private messages, now floated in the air, impossible to ignore or explain away. The next morning dawned in pale shades of gray, filtered through heavy curtains and a silence so deep it felt holy, or perhaps funereal. Julia woke before anyone else. Her mouth was parched, her eyes gritty from weeping and lack of sleep. She stretched out stiffly, the memory of the previous night flooding her with an ache so profound she could almost taste it. There was no euphoria, no feeling of triumph, only the sharp, persistent soreness of having finally shattered the brittle piece her family had clung to. She wandered to the kitchen, where empty glasses and plates from the night before awaited cleaning. She rinsed them robotically, the water's hush only amplifying her sense of detachment. She had spoken her piece. Now she was nowhere, neither a villain nor a victor, simply someone raw and exposed, her wounds no longer invisible. By midday, the family began to stir uncomfortably back to life. Her mother spoke little, moving methodically through the motions of tidying up. Her father sat by the window, newspaper clenched and unread, eyes fixed on a city awash in the washed-out sunlight of early March. Julia watched them, searching for any trace of the old gentleness, a hand on her shoulder, an invitation to talk, even a look of understanding. But there was only exhaustion, layered atop confusion and the kind of hurt that finds no language. Emily did not come downstairs. News of the previous night's eruption traveled swiftly through the family grapevine. Phone calls and messages trickled in, hesitant and coded. Some relatives sought details, others pretended nothing had occurred, and a few sent stiff "thinking of you" texts to both sisters. Julia's phone vibrated, each new alert a tremor in her pocket. Among her cousins, lines were quickly drawn. Those who'd always envied Emily's perfection now felt validated. Those who had admired her were shocked and defensive, seeking alternate explanations. "She's not the only one at fault," one message read. "You must have had your reasons, but this isn't right," said another. Julia scrolled past the messages, numbness growing with every line. A few friends from school, having heard embellished versions of the events, reached out with their own judgments, whispered through social networks and group chats. The truth, now public, changed the shape of every relationship Julia had. Sympathy was rare. Suspicion, or awkward silence, far more common. Instead of relief, Julia felt more visible than ever, in precisely the wrong way. Her parents eventually called a family meeting, the participants stiff and scattered across the living room's length. Her mother's voice trembled, not out of rage, but from wanting so badly to believe that their family would survive this. "We can't pretend nothing's happened," she said, rubbing her hands together as if scrubbing away a stain. "But I want both of you to know we love you, no matter what." Her father looked older than Julia remembered. His posture slumped, his words measured and slow. "We're going to need time," he said. "All of us." Emily finally emerged, her face pale and puffy, the careful armor of perfect hair and makeup gone. She hovered at the edge of the room, refusing to look at Julia, her gaze wandering the floor. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice raspy and dull. "Not like this." Julia, who had imagined this moment for so long, that shining instant when her pain would finally be acknowledged, found no satisfaction in her sister's anguish. Instead, she saw Emily's vulnerability for the first time, the slump of her shoulders, the tremble in her wrists. It was not vindication that Julia felt, but the sting of a door slamming shut on all those years of childhood laughter and secrets whispered under bed sheets. The aftermath of the exposure rippled outward. At school, Emily's reputation began to unspool. There were looks in the hallway, whispers behind hands, questions suddenly tinged with suspicion rather than admiration. Teachers regarded her with wariness. Her status as the infallible golden child now irreparably wounded. A few of her closest friends rallied to her side, but others kept their distance, afraid of being pulled into the crossfire. Julia, too, noticed the shift. Neither embraced nor shunned, she drifted from one class to the next. In art, her drawings changed once more. Sharp edges and blurred backgrounds, faces half obscured by shadows. She wondered, sometimes, if she'd been fair. If all the secrets had needed to come out the way they had, or if she'd acted from a place of pain rather than justice. But it was too late for doubt. The machinery of consequence had been set in motion, and there was no way to call it back. At home, the sisters became ghosts to each other. In rare moments, when they passed in the hallway, Emily's eyes flitted away, and Julia found herself missing the old patterns, the gentle teasing, the borrowed sweaters, the sense, no matter how fraught, of being us against the world. Now they were strangers in shared rooms, too wary, too wounded to try reaching across the gulf. The rest of the Parker family tried to bridge the silence. Relatives called, invitations extended for dinner or walks or coffee, but nothing felt natural anymore. Family group chats fizzled, replaced by one-on-one conversations, each tiptoeing carefully around the wound. Emily's absence from a gathering was met with strained explanations. Julia's presence, with polite but distant warmth. Through all this, Julia's hope that she'd be understood, that her voice would finally matter, faded beneath the heavy fallout of truth. She realized now that exposure didn't bring healing, not automatically anyway. It only tore away the illusions, leaving everyone raw and scrambling for meaning. The truth, once spoken, could not be undone. Julia lay awake at night, listening to the city beyond her window and wondering where things would go from here. She had wanted resolution. She had wanted belonging. But instead she found herself on the other side of a wall she'd helped build, both freer and lonelier than ever before. In the end, the only certain thing was this. Nothing about their family, their sisterhood, or themselves would ever be quite the same. The truth had been exposed, not to offer closure, but to force each of them to reckon with its consequences in private moments and public spaces for months and years to come. And somewhere deep in that new silence, between grief, guilt, and the faint outline of hope, Julia waited to see what could possibly grow in the place of everything that had been lost. Irreparable fracture. The Parker apartment, once resonant with sisterly laughter and the familiar symphony of a busy family, settled into a quiet that was no longer peaceful, but strained, like the silence following an earthquake when everyone is too stunned to speak or even measure the damage. After Julia exposed Emily at the family gathering, the shockwaves didn't subside. They rippled outward, amplifying the divides that had long lain beneath the surface. For days, Emily barely emerged from her room except for the necessities. Bathroom, mealtimes taken silently at odd hours, or brief forays to the kitchen. When the sisters crossed paths, they slipped away as quickly as possible, not daring to exchange even a glance, much less a word. Their parents, devastated and unsure how to restore order, tiptoed around both daughters. Every interaction was painfully polite. Their dad, always the peacekeeper, became reserved, lost in his own contemplations. Their mother seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, her attempts to spark conversation brittle and awkward. The breakfasts that once buzzed with good-natured debates were now marked by the clinking of spoons and long, uncomfortable silences. No one wanted to admit it, but the foundation of their family had cracked, and everyone, in their own way, could feel the fault lines widening. Emily, the golden girl no longer, found herself shunned in spaces she once dominated. Classmates she considered friends avoided her gaze in the hallways. Teachers, previously delighted by her diligence and charm, now interacted with her gingerly, as if unsure which Emily they were speaking to, the role model or the girl with secrets. Rumors morphed and spread, and Emily felt her sense of self erode beneath the constant scrutiny. In her isolation, she tried to process everything that had happened. Deep inside, she nursed a bitterness toward Julia, resentment for having aired private struggles so publicly, for shattering the illusion of family unity. But alongside that resentment, regret took root. Emily knew she'd crossed a line with Ryan, knew her mistakes had sown the seeds of their destruction, but she'd never imagined things would unravel so spectacularly, or that her sister would be the one to rip off the mask. Nights became the hardest. Lying awake, Emily replayed the balcony whispers and rushed texts that foreshadowed the betrayal. She felt both wronged and desperate for forgiveness, but pride left her stranded, unwilling to reach out and unable to move forward. Julia, meanwhile, did not find the relief she'd imagined. The momentary vindication from finally being seen was quickly eclipsed by a hollowness that settled deep within her. She went through each day wrapped in a kind of numb armor. Teachers, aware of the family drama, treaded carefully, offering vague words of encouragement that rang hollow. Her friends dwindled, some afraid to pick sides, others quietly shuffling closer to Emily as if Julia's pain were somehow contagious. She clung to her art, throwing herself into painting and sketching with frantic energy. Yet even there the satisfaction was fleeting. As winter light dimmed earlier each afternoon, Julia wondered if she had fundamentally misunderstood what it meant to get justice, or to be truly heard. Grudges, she realized, didn't heal wounds, they deepened them. One afternoon, Julia came home to find her mother sitting alone on the couch, staring at old family photos scattered on the coffee table. The silence between them pressed down, heavy and unyielding. Her mother broke it first. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, voice crumbling. Julia sat beside her, overwhelmed by both guilt and a child's ache for comfort. But no words came. There were no explanations left, no reassurances. Only exhaustion and the silent acknowledgement that something precious had been broken. The wider family's response only made things worse. Some relatives blamed Julia for her vindictiveness. Others blamed Emily for her original betrayal. Still others simply withdrew, not wanting to be entangled in the Parker sisters' drama. Family events shrunk, invitations grew rare. Where once holiday parties had drawn cousins from across the city, now only a handful gathered, and even then, the conversation turned quickly away from anything meaningful. Emily's fate at school was just as bleak. One by one, the leadership positions she'd held slipped away. Younger classmates who had idolized her looked elsewhere for inspiration. There were no more invitations to prom committees or music competitions. Coaches quietly replaced her as team captain, citing a need for fresh leadership. It was not official exile, but it was absolute. Emily was there, but never central again. Desperate for escape, Emily started spending weekends away, at the library, at cafes, aimlessly walking city blocks, or sprawled on a park bench staring at the same sky she and Julia used to watch together as children. Each time she passed something they'd shared, a favorite tree, a mural they'd painted together for a school project, remorse and anger choked out any hope of reconciliation. At home, Julia sometimes hovered outside Emily's door, listening for signs of life. Shuffling feet, the brief creak of a chair, the static of a muted phone call. She'd lift her hand to knock, 1,000 apologies racing through her mind, but always faltered and withdrew. She knew that if Emily answered, if their eyes met, everything unsaid might spill out, messy and unmanageable. Both girls became shadows in their own home, orbiting around each other, trapped by grief and pride. Their parents grew more and more desperate. Family dinners were enforced with gentle threats, arguments whispered behind closed doors more often. Nothing thawed the ice. Around them, the seasons shifted. Spring brought cherry blossoms to the city, but the Parker apartment stayed in a perpetual winter. The sisters lived as if behind glass, watching the world move on as theirs stood painfully still. On a Saturday in late March, their father suggested a family outing, a humble gesture, a visit to the lakeside. Emily declined without explanation. Julia offered only a shrug. Their mother wiped her eyes and took the dog for a walk alone. The sense of loss had shifted from acute to chronic. No longer a sharp pain, but a slow erosion of hope and connection. Something neither apology nor time seemed equipped to mend. Still, each held tight to stubborn remnants of love, however warped. Julia would linger over old photos, searching for evidence of sisterhood. Emily would pause by Julia's latest painting, fingers twitching with a half-forgotten urge to praise. Yet neither could speak, and so each day the rift grew wider, filled with memories no one dared revive. They learned, slowly and without wanting to, that not every broken thing could be restored. Some hurts, once exposed, grew roots too deep, their consequences reshaping every part of the life they touched. For the Parker sisters, forgiveness became not a certainty, but a distant, unreachable point on their separate paths. In that irreparable fracture, their family learned to exist, but never truly together, not as they had been before. Echoes and regret. Spring unfurled over the city, softening winter's gray grip with sprigs of green and the high, hopeful trill of sparrows. Windows were flung open to catch the breeze. Stores swapped heavy sweaters for sundresses, and neighbors began to gather on stoops after dark. For many, these warmer days sparked a spirit of renewal. But within the Parker apartment, the air felt stale, the after effects of pain and resentment stagnating like dust in sunbeams. Julia wandered through the days with a heaviness she had not imagined could last. Regret, once a faint ache behind her ribs, now bloomed in her chest with every morning's light. She replayed the family gathering over and over in her mind, sifting through details. Her trembling hands, Emily's stricken face, the slow dawning shock on her parents' features, the awkward dispersal of relatives. Memory spun the scene in loops. Each time, Julia tried to convince herself she'd had no other choice, but each time, doubt gnawed deeper. The relief she'd longed for, the vindication, the hope that being seen would heal old wounds, never arrived. Instead, solitude grew rooted in her bones. Friends at school approached her with wary sympathy, then drifted away when they saw she could not pretend all was normal. At home, her parents kept a nervous distance, offering small kindnesses, a cup of tea, a gentle hand on her shoulder, but never the warm, unguarded love Julia remembered from before. She often felt like a ghost haunting her own childhood, stuck between innocence and the too-soon adulthood brought on by betrayal. Art, once her greatest solace, offered only incomplete relief. Her sketchbooks filled with restless lines, empty cityscapes, reflections of her own face bisected by shadow, figures walking away from each other into dusk. Mrs. Navarro continued to invite Julia to join competitions or submit her work to the spring showcase, but Julia rarely responded. Her confidence, always fragile, had been shattered. She wondered what it might be like to create something for the pleasure of it again, rather than trying to prove her own worth. Most nights, Julia stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The silence in the apartment pressed down on her, thick and relentless. She caught herself listening for Emily's soft piano scales, the tick of fingers tapping on a phone, shared midnight laughter from their younger years. Instead, there was nothing, just the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the far-off wail of city sirens. Sometimes, in dreams, Julia found herself back at that pivotal evening, wishing she'd chosen differently, that she'd confronted Emily in private, that she'd found words with less bitterness, or let time do the work of healing instead. The regret was not only about what she had done, but what had been lost. Something vulnerable had shattered, not just a relationship, but the possibility of it ever being remade the same way. Emily, too, was changing in the aftermath. She began to spend more time away from home, coming and going at odd hours. She joined a weekend volunteer group at a community center across town, cleaning playgrounds and organizing reading hours for children. It wasn't escape so much as silent rebuilding, but it felt to Julia like loss all the same. At home, Emily's presence was a shadow flickering in peripheral vision, silent at meals, locking herself away in her room, avoiding even the slightest brush in shared spaces. Through closed doors, Julia sometimes overheard quiet crying, a muffled phone conversation, the shudder of Emily's breath. She wished for the courage to knock, to try to bridge the chasm with a word or an apology. But guilt kept her frozen. Every attempt she rehearsed ended in failure. What words were left that hadn't already been twisted by anger or eroded by silence? Her parents, desperate to restore balance, suggested therapy. For Emily, for Julia, for the whole family. Julia almost laughed at the idea. What would she say, sitting across from a stranger, that she couldn't admit even to herself? That in her yearning to feel heard, she'd traded one pain for another? That justice, when it came, wasn't neat or clarifying, but jagged and endlessly complicated? Spring wore on. Graduation approached. Talk at home turned to college acceptances, financial aid, the logistics of moving away. Both sisters, for the first time, seemed eager to leave, each chasing the uneasy hope that distance might eclipse sorrow. Julia received an acceptance from an art program in another city. It was everything she'd worked for, yet the idea of leaving home brought more anxiety than excitement. Late one evening, close to midnight, Julia crept into the kitchen for water. She found Emily at the stove, stirring a mug of tea. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met and held. The silence was thick. So many unsaid apologies and accusations compressed into a single look. Emily broke it first. Are you really leaving this summer?" Julia nodded, her heart twisting. "I think I need to. I don't know how to stay here and feel—" She stopped, words falling away. Emily looked down. Her voice was soft, almost timid. "I miss us. I keep wishing I could go back." The edges of her lips trembled, but she shook her head. "I don't know how to fix it." Julia hesitated, then offered a broken smile. "Me neither." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But in that midnight kitchen, regret began to loosen its grip. They stood beside each other in awkward, thoughtful quiet. There would be no sudden return to the past, no magical mending of every fracture, but perhaps, at least, there was room to mourn together for all they had lost. Their parents noticed the change, fleeting moments of shared laughter. The two sisters pausing, just for a second, at the same window to watch a thunderstorm. Small mercies, scattered among the days. June finally arrived, layering sidewalks with magnolia petals and offering the promise of new beginnings. Julia packed her art supplies into boxes, wrapped her sketchbooks in old scarves, and stood at her window one last time before leaving for school. There was a bittersweet hope in her chest. Maybe regret, like any wound, could one day shape itself into something quieter, something that no longer hurt quite so sharply, given enough time. Emily came to say goodbye as Julia was slipping on her shoes, awkward but determined. "You'll do great things," she said, voice sincere. "I mean it." Julia nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "You too." The apartment door closed softly behind her, and with that, a chapter ended. Not with a final act of forgiveness, but with a fragile understanding, stitched with echoes of everything unsaid and the honesty of regret. As Julia stepped into the sunlight, she carried both loss and the faintest outline of hope, knowing that even if some fractures never fully healed, there was still a future to claim, one uncertain step at a time.